Tonight, as the day slowly settles behind you, you're invited to rest your thoughts and allow your breathing to soften. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go, only a quiet story to keep you company as sleep gently arrives. In this episode, we'll explore a true chapter of American history, a time just after the Civil War, when the nation briefly imagined a future of shared opportunity, and how that vision gradually faded into the background of everyday life. This is not a story of urgency or debate, but a calm reflection on how history often unfolds quietly. Over time. If you find comfort in falling asleep to true, thoughtfully told history, you're welcome to subscribe, so these peaceful nights of storytelling are always waiting for you. And as you begin to drift, you may wish to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight, whether it's a small town, a quiet city street, or somewhere in between. It's a gentle way to connect, and a reminder that this story is being heard across many peaceful places at once. Now, take a slow breath in, and as you breathe out, let the past unfold softly, one calm moment at a time. Asterisk. In the quiet years that followed the Civil War, the United States stood in a rare and uncertain stillness. The great noise of conflict had ended, and with it the constant motion of armies, supplies, and commands. What remained was a nation learning how to breathe again. Across towns, farms, and cities, mornings arrived without cannon fire, and evenings passed without the distant echo of marching feet. For many Americans, this silence felt unfamiliar, even fragile, as though the country itself were waking from a long and difficult night. The war had altered nearly every part of life. Rail lines lay twisted, fields stood untended, and families were scattered across regions they had never expected to see. Yet alongside the damage, there existed a powerful sense of possibility. The end of slavery had reshaped the legal meaning of freedom, and for the first time, millions of formerly enslaved people could imagine lives directed by their own choices. At the same time, the nation as a whole faced a profound question. What kind of society would emerge from the ruins of war? In the early mornings of this post-war era, the country felt suspended between what had been and what might come next. Markets reopened, schools slowly resumed, and churches filled with quiet prayers for stability. The routines of daily life returned in small steps, yet beneath these familiar patterns lay unresolved questions about work, land, and belonging. Freedom, many realized, was more than the absence of chains. It required security, opportunity, and the chance to build a future without constant fear of loss. For formerly enslaved Americans, the dawn after the war carried both hope and uncertainty. Families reunited after years of forced separation, sometimes finding one another through handwritten notices or word passed quietly from town to town. Education became a shared aspiration, with makeshift schools forming wherever teachers and students could gather. Land ownership, too, became a central dream, a symbol of independence and a foundation for stability. To own land meant not only shelter and food, but dignity, self-direction, and the promise that one's labor would finally benefit one's own family. Across the nation, political leaders debated how best to rebuild. Some believed the country required bold action, new laws, federal oversight, and sustained commitment to ensure that freedom translated into real opportunity. Others argued for a faster return to local control and familiar social arrangements, hoping to restore economic productivity as quickly as possible. These discussions were not always loud or dramatic. Often they unfolded in committee rooms, private correspondence, and carefully worded speeches. Yet the outcomes of these debates would shape daily life for generations. In rural areas, especially in the South, the transition from slavery to free labor proved complex and uneven. Plantations that once relied on forced labor now sought new systems to maintain production. Contracts replaced commands, but power imbalances remained. Many newly freed workers entered agreements that promised wages or shares of crops, only to find themselves bound by debt, unclear terms, or shifting expectations. Even so, the mere act of negotiating one's labor marked a profound change. A step, however, limited towards self-determination. In northern cities. Factories expanded and industries adapted to post-war demands. Veterans returned home carrying physical and emotional scars, while immigrants continued to arrive, drawn by the promise of work and stability. Economic growth resumed, but it did not spread evenly. Some communities rebuilt quickly, while others struggled with shortages of capital, infrastructure, and trust. The nation's economic landscape, like its political one, reflected both resilience and imbalance. Amid these changes, the federal government took on responsibilities it had never fully assumed before. Relief programs distributed food and supplies to those displaced by the war. New agencies attempted to mediate labor disputes, oversee education efforts, and protect basic rights. These initiatives were ambitious and at times unprecedented. They signaled an understanding that rebuilding the nation required more than repairing bridges and railroads. It required addressing how people lived, worked, and planned for the future. Yet this period of Reconstruction unfolded under constant strain. War fatigue lingered, and many Americans longed for a return to simplicity and familiar rhythms. The idea of prolonged federal involvement in local affairs felt unsettling to some, while others worried that without such involvement, the promises of freedom would remain incomplete. These tensions did not always appear as open conflict. Often, they surfaced quietly, in delayed funding, limited enforcement, or gradual shifts in public attention. As the sun rose each morning over farms and towns, ordinary people continued their lives within this uncertain landscape. Children attended newly opened schools, sometimes in borrowed buildings or open fields. Workers gathered tools and supplies, negotiating wages and conditions as best they could. Families planned modest futures, planting crops, repairing homes, saving small amounts of money when possible. Their efforts were acts of faith, rooted in the belief that peace would eventually bring fairness and stability. This dawn period in American history was not a single moment, but a slow unfolding. It carried within it both the highest aspirations and the earliest signs of retreat. The nation had acknowledged that freedom required recognition under the law, yet it had not fully agreed on how far that recognition should extend into economic life. Land, labor, education, and wealth remained unevenly distributed, even as the language of equality gained prominence. In the gentle quiet of these post-war years, history moved without urgency. Decisions made in calm rooms and quiet votes gradually shaped outcomes more enduring than any battlefield victory. The future of economic equality, so vivid in imagination during the war's end, began to depend not on grand declarations, but on sustained commitment, patience, and collective will. As night approaches, and this story continues. It is worth remembering that this moment after the Civil War was neither purely hopeful nor entirely bleak. It was a beginning of fragile morning light spreading across a changed nation, illuminating possibilities that were real, yet not guaranteed. In that soft dawn, the course of the country rested not on what had been promised, but on what would be chosen, day after day, in the quiet hours that followed. When the Civil War ended, freedom arrived as both a declaration and a question. Emancipation had removed the legal structure of slavery, yet it did not, by itself, explain how free life would function in practice. Across the country, and especially in the former slaveholding states, Americans began to discover that freedom was not a single event, but a process, one that required definition, protection, and time. For millions of newly freed men and women, freedom was first experienced in deeply personal ways. It meant choosing where to walk, when to work, and how to gather with family. Simple acts, deciding one's daily routine, negotiating one's labor, learning to read took on immense meaning. These moments were quiet, often unnoticed by the wider nation, yet they represented a profound shift in how life could be lived. Almost immediately, it became clear that legal freedom alone was not enough. Without land, savings, or access to stable employment, many formerly enslaved people faced uncertainty that felt unsettlingly familiar. The end of bondage had not erased the economic systems that had depended on it. Fields still needed tending, crops still needed harvesting, and those who owned land still held leverage over those who did not. Freedom, many realized, would need an economic foundation if it were to endure. Land emerged as a central symbol of this broader meaning of freedom. To own land was to control one's labor and secure one's future. It offered independence from exploitative contracts and protection against sudden displacement. Across rural communities, hopes for land ownership spread quietly, passed through conversation and observation. Small plots, modest homes, and family farms became imagined pathways toward stability and dignity. Education also took on new importance. Literacy had long been denied to enslaved populations, and learning to read and write became both a practical skill and a statement of identity. Schools sprang up in churches, homes, and temporary structures, often supported by community effort. Adults attended classes alongside children, studying late into the evening after long days of work. Education promised not only opportunity, but a sense of belonging in a society where laws, contracts, and records shaped everyday life. Work itself began to change in form, though not always in substance. Wage labor and share-based agreements replaced forced labor, introducing the language of contracts and compensation. Yet these arrangements were often shaped by imbalance. Many workers entered agreements without access to legal counsel or financial reserves, leaving them vulnerable to unfair terms. Debt could accumulate quietly, tying families to land they did not own and limiting mobility. Despite these challenges, the act of negotiating labor represented a meaningful departure from the past. Even limited choices marked progress. Formerly enslaved individuals discussed wages, working hours, and family needs conversations that had once been unthinkable. These negotiations, carried out in fields and offices, reflected an emerging belief that freedom involved participation, not just release. Families, too, sought to redefine themselves within this new reality. Marriage ceremonies formalized relationships that slavery had never legally recognized. Parents searched for children sold away years earlier, using notices, letters, and word-of-mouth networks. These reunions, when they occurred, were deeply emotional, though many searches ended without resolution. Still, the effort itself underscored a broader truth. Freedom included the right to family life, continuity, and memory. Meanwhile, the wider nation struggled to reconcile different interpretations of freedom. Some Americans believed emancipation fulfilled the country's obligation, and that further intervention was unnecessary. Others argued that without economic and legal safeguards, freedom would remain incomplete. These disagreements shaped public policy in subtle ways, influencing funding decisions, enforcement priorities, and the duration of reform efforts. In cities and towns beyond the former plantations, similar questions unfolded. Industrial workers, immigrants, and veterans all confronted economic uncertainty in a rapidly changing economy. Wages fluctuated, housing shortages emerged, and competition for work intensified. While their experiences differed, many Americans shared a sense that freedom and opportunity were increasingly tied to access to education, capital, and stable employment. This broader context influenced how freedom was understood nationally. It became clear that economic security played a central role in determining who could fully participate in civic life. Those with resources navigated systems more easily, while those without faced barriers that were difficult to overcome. Freedom, though universal in principle, Varied in experience, the challenge lay in transforming moral ideals into durable structures. Laws could declare rights, but institutions were needed to support them. Schools required funding, land ownership required legal protection, and fair labor required oversight. These needs did not announce themselves dramatically. Instead, they appeared gradually in the daily realities of families trying to plan for the next season or the next generation. As time passed, the urgency surrounding these issues began to soften in the national consciousness. Other concerns, economic growth, political stability, westward expansion, competed for attention. The meaning of freedom, once discussed openly, became less central in public debate. Yet for those living its consequences, the question remained immediate and personal. In the quiet rhythm of post-war life, freedom continued to be defined not by speeches or proclamations, but by lived experience. It was found in classrooms filled with whispered reading lessons, in fields where labor was bargained rather than commanded, and in homes where families planned futures with cautious hope. These moments formed the foundation of a broader understanding that freedom, to be lasting, required more than release. It required support. As this story moves forward, the nation's response to that realization becomes increasingly important. Whether freedom would deepen into genuine economic security or remain limited by circumstance depended on choices made slowly, often without fanfare. In this stillness, the true shape of post-war freedom began to take form, carrying with it both promise and uncertainty, as America continued its careful steps into a new and uncharted day. In the years immediately following the Civil War, the United States entered a period unlike any it had known before. The conflict had not only preserved the Union, but had also transformed its moral and legal foundations. With slavery abolished, the nation faced a question that reached far beyond reunification. Could equality be deliberately built, guided, and sustained by national effort? For a brief and remarkable time, many believed the answer might be yes. Reconstruction emerged as more than a policy framework. It was an idea-shared undertaking that sought to redefine citizenship, opportunity, and belonging. Lawmakers, educators, community leaders, and ordinary citizens engaged in a collective attempt to imagine a society where freedom carried tangible meaning. This vision did not arise suddenly or uniformly, but it gained momentum as the realities of post-war life became clear. At the heart of Reconstruction was the belief that the federal government had a responsibility to help shape fair conditions for its citizens. This marked a departure from earlier traditions that emphasized limited national involvement in local affairs. The devastation of war, combined with the moral weight of emancipation, led many to conclude that passive governance would not be enough. Equality, they argued, required structure. In legislative halls, debates unfolded over the scope of federal authority. Some representatives envisioned a strong national role in protecting civil rights, supporting education, and ensuring access to economic opportunity. They spoke of citizenship not as a privilege granted by states, but as a status guaranteed by the nation itself. Others expressed caution, warning that too much central power could disrupt local customs and economic recovery. These discussions were often measured rather than dramatic, yet they carried lasting consequences. One of the most significant elements of Reconstruction's vision was the redefinition of citizenship. New constitutional amendments sought to establish clear standards for who belonged and what protections they were entitled to receive. Citizenship was no longer to be defined by race or prior condition, but by shared membership in the nation. This shift represented a profound reimagining of American identity, one that extended beyond legal language into everyday expectations. Education stood at the center of this national project. Schools were viewed as pathways to participation, equipping citizens with the skills needed to navigate contracts, laws, and civic life. Public education systems expanded, often for the first time in many regions. These schools served children and adults alike, fostering a sense that learning was not merely personal advancement, but a public good. The presence of classrooms in newly rebuilt communities symbolized a belief in long-term investment. Economic participation was another cornerstone of Reconstruction's ambitions. Lawmakers and reformers understood that political rights would be difficult to exercise without material stability. Discussions of land access, fair labor practices, and credit systems reflected an awareness that opportunity was shaped by resources. While solutions varied and were often incomplete, the acknowledgement itself marked a step toward a more inclusive understanding of equality. Communities responded to these efforts in diverse ways. In some places, local leaders worked alongside federal initiatives, establishing schools, organizing civic meetings, and experimenting with new forms of governance. In others, skepticism or resistance slowed progress. Yet even where implementation lagged, the language of Reconstruction introduced new expectations. Equality was no longer framed solely as an abstract ideal, but as something that could be measured in schools built, contracts honored, and rights upheld. The vision of Reconstruction also extended to political participation. Voting rights and representation were seen as essential components of national belonging. Elections during this period carried heightened significance, as newly enfranchised citizens took part in shaping local and state governments. These moments were often quiet, conducted in small polling places, yet they embodied the broader aspiration of shared governance. Despite its ambition, Reconstruction remained fragile. Its success depended on sustained attention, funding, and enforcement elements that were never guaranteed. Economic pressures, political fatigue, and shifting priorities competed with reform efforts. Still, during these early years, the prevailing tone was one of possibility. The nation had acknowledged that equality could not be left to chance. What made Reconstruction distinctive was not only what it attempted, but how it framed responsibility. Rather than viewing inequality as an inevitable outcome of circumstance, it treated it as a condition shaped by policy and choice. This perspective suggested that the nation could learn from its past and deliberately chart a different course. It was a hopeful stance, grounded in the belief that institutions could be improved. At the same time, Reconstruction's vision was not uniform or complete. It reflected the limitations of its era, shaped by compromise and constraint. Not all voices were equally heard, and not all proposals were pursued. Yet the existence of a national conversation about equality marked a departure from earlier patterns. The country was, for a moment, willing to ask itself difficult questions. As days passed and years accumulated, the intensity of this vision would face challenges. The work of building equality proved slower and more complex than many had anticipated. Progress came in increments rather than transformations. Even so, the early Reconstruction period left a lasting imprint on the American imagination. In the quiet flow of post-war life, the vision of Reconstruction functioned like a guiding light present, even when obscured by clouds of uncertainty. It suggested that equality was not merely a hope reserved for speeches, but a project that required patience, cooperation, and resolve. Whether that project would continue or fade remained uncertain, but its initial clarity offered a rare glimpse of what the nation believed it might become. As this story continues, the focus shifts from aspiration to endurance. The ideals of Reconstruction, once set in motion, would soon encounter forces that tested their strength. Yet understanding this moment, when equality was treated as a shared national endeavor, helps illuminate both what was attempted and what was left unfinished as America moved quietly forward into the long unfolding of its history. In the months following the Civil War, few ideas captured the imagination of newly freed Americans more clearly than the possibility of land ownership. Land represented more than soil and crops. It stood for independence, stability, and the chance to build a life guided by one's own labor. In this hopeful moment, a phrase began to circulate, simple, practical, and filled with meaning: 40 acres and a mule. The idea did not emerge from fantasy. It grew out of wartime experience and post-war necessity. As Union forces moved through the South, abandoned plantations and confiscated lands came under federal control. Military leaders, confronted with thousands of displaced families, sought immediate solutions. Land redistribution appeared both practical and just providing food production, reducing dependency on aid and offering a tangible foundation for freedom. For a brief time, this vision seemed attainable. Certain policies allowed formerly enslaved families to settle on parcels of land, cultivating fields that had once symbolized their forced labor. These early arrangements fostered a sense of possibility. Families built modest homes, planted crops, and organized communities. The rhythm of daily work carried new meaning, as effort and reward felt directly connected. The promise of land ownership spread quickly through conversation and observation. Even those who had not yet received land believed that opportunity might soon follow. This expectation shaped how freedom was understood. Emancipation was no longer only about release from bondage, it was about access to resources. That made independence sustainable. Yet, the legal foundation for widespread land redistribution was uncertain from the beginning. While some policymakers supported the idea, others viewed it as temporary or overly disruptive. Questions arose about property rights, compensation, and the appropriate role of the federal government. These debates unfolded quietly, often far from the fields where families were working the land they hoped to keep. As political leadership shifted, priorities began to change. Calls for national reconciliation gained strength, emphasizing unity over transformation. Restoring land to former owners was framed as a step toward stability and economic recovery. Slowly, policies that had enabled land redistribution were revised or reversed. Families who had begun to imagine permanent futures found themselves facing uncertainty once more. The transition was often abrupt. Notices arrived, sometimes delivered without ceremony, informing settlers that the land would be reclaimed. Crops planted with care were left behind, and homes built with hope were abandoned. These moments rarely appeared in official records with emotional detail, yet their impact lingered deeply within the communities affected. Without land, many families turned to new labor arrangements. Sharecropping and tenant farming emerged as common systems, offering access to land in exchange for a portion of the harvest. At first glance, these agreements appeared to provide opportunity. They allowed families to remain connected to agriculture and offered a degree of autonomy compared to slavery. In practice, however, these systems often limited long-term progress. Contracts were complex, credit was scarce, and debt accumulated easily. Without ownership, families remained vulnerable to poor harvests, fluctuating prices, and changing terms. Economic independence, once within reach, became more difficult to achieve. Still, the memory of land ownership endured. Stories of the early post-war years circulated quietly, reminding communities that another path had once seemed possible. These recollections were not always shared publicly, but they influenced how people understood their circumstances. The loss of land was felt not only as an economic setback, but as a narrowing of opportunity. Nationally, the abandonment of land redistribution marked a turning point. It signaled a shift away from structural change toward more limited reforms. Equality, once imagined as something that could be built through shared access to resources, became increasingly defined by legal status alone. The gap between freedom in principle and freedom in practice widened. For many Americans beyond the South, the issue faded from view. Economic growth elsewhere, and the passage of time softened the sense of urgency. Yet the consequences of these early decisions continued to shape lives quietly, influencing patterns of wealth, stability, and mobility. The story of 40 acres and a mule is not one of a single promise made and broken, but of a moment when the nation stood at a crossroads. One path emphasized long-term investment in independence. The other prioritized swift reconciliation and familiar economic structures. The choice was made gradually, through policy adjustments rather than dramatic announcements. As evening settles into this chapter of history, the fields once cultivated with hope remain part of the landscape, even if their original promise faded. The idea that land could anchor freedom did not disappear entirely. It lingered as a reminder of what had briefly been imagined. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that economic equality depends not only on intention, but on follow-through. The promise of land showed how close independence once felt, and how easily it could slip away without sustained commitment. In the quiet aftermath of Reconstruction's early years, this lesson settled gently into the nation's story, shaping the course of opportunity for generations to come. In the unsettled years after the Civil War, the federal government faced an unprecedented challenge. Millions of people had been freed from bondage. Entire regions lay economically disrupted, and long-standing social systems had been abruptly dismantled. Into this uncertain landscape stepped a new institution, created to manage transition rather than permanence: the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau was established with a broad and ambitious purpose to provide relief, guidance, and support to those navigating freedom for the first time, while also helping stabilize the war-torn South. Its responsibilities were wide-ranging. It distributed food and clothing, oversaw labor contracts, supported schools, and offered limited legal assistance. For a nation unused to federal involvement in everyday life, this represented a significant shift in governance. In practice, the Bureau's presence was often felt quietly. Agents worked from modest offices, traveling by horse or rail to remote communities. They listened to disputes, recorded contracts, and attempted to mediate conflicts between landowners and workers. These tasks were rarely dramatic, yet they shaped daily life in meaningful ways. For many formerly enslaved families, the Bureau was the first institution to acknowledge their concerns within a formal system. Education became one of the Bureau's most visible and enduring contributions. Schools supported or coordinated by the agency appeared across the South, sometimes in borrowed churches or simple wooden buildings. Teachers, many of them newly arrived from other regions, worked alongside local communities to establish routines of learning. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught not only as skills, but as tools for independence. These classrooms carried a quiet sense of purpose. Adults and children gathered together, often after long workdays, to study by lamplight. Attendance was not always consistent, as economic demands frequently intervened, yet the desire to learn remained strong. Education offered a way to engage with contracts, laws, and correspondence elements of civic life that shaped opportunity. The Bureau also played a role in labor arrangements during the transition from slavery to wage-based systems. Agents reviewed contracts to ensure basic terms were stated clearly, attempting to prevent the most overt forms of exploitation. This oversight introduced new expectations into the labor market. Work was to be compensated, agreements documented, and disputes addressed through dialogue rather than force. Still, the Bureau's authority was limited. It lacked sufficient staff, funding, and long-term backing. In many areas, one agent was responsible for overseeing thousands of people spread across vast distances. Enforcement depended heavily on cooperation from local authorities, which varied widely. Where support existed, progress followed. Where it did not, the Bureau's influence was constrained. Political uncertainty further complicated its mission. From its inception, the Bureau faced criticism from those who viewed it as unnecessary or intrusive. Some argued that its work prolonged dependency, while others feared it disrupted traditional labor relations. These debates unfolded alongside broader disagreements about Reconstruction itself, shaping how long the Bureau would be allowed to operate. Despite these challenges, moments of genuine assistance occurred daily. Families received food during shortages, workers gained recognition for unpaid labor, and children learned to read their first words. These successes were modest, yet deeply felt. They demonstrated how targeted support could ease transition and reduce vulnerability during periods of rapid change. At the same time, structural limitations became increasingly apparent. The Bureau was designed as a temporary institution, not a permanent foundation. Its mandate emphasized immediate relief rather than long-term economic restructuring. Land redistribution, for example, remained largely outside its authority. Without control over resources, such as land or capital, the Bureau could address symptoms, but not underlying disparities. As national attention shifted, the Bureau's future grew uncertain. Funding renewals became contentious, and its responsibilities were gradually reduced. When the agency was eventually dissolved, many of its functions were left without clear successors. Schools continued in some areas through local effort, but other forms of support faded quietly. The conclusion of the Bureau's work did not arrive with ceremony. Offices closed, agents departed, and records were filed away. For those who had relied on its assistance, the transition felt abrupt. The protective presence that had mediated disputes and provided aid was no longer available, leaving individuals to navigate complex systems largely on their own. In hindsight, the Freedmen's Bureau stands as a symbol of both possibility and constraint. It showed that coordinated national effort could ease the passage from bondage to freedom, yet it also revealed the limits of temporary solutions. Without sustained commitment, even well-intentioned programs struggled to produce lasting change. For the broader nation, the Bureau represented an experiment, one that tested how far responsibility for equality would extend beyond declarations of principle. Its mixed outcomes reflected the tensions of the era. Hope tempered by hesitation, progress shaped by compromise. As this chapter draws to a close, the story of the Freedmen's Bureau settles into the larger narrative of Reconstruction. It was neither a complete success nor a simple failure. Instead, it marked a moment when the nation acknowledged that freedom required support, and then wrestled with how much support it was willing to provide. In the quiet spaces left behind, the questions the Bureau addressed did not disappear. They continued to surface in the lives of families seeking education, fair work, and stability. And though the agency itself faded into history, its brief existence offered a glimpse of what might have been possible with time, resources, and sustained resolve. An echo of an unfinished effort carried gently forward into the unfolding story of America's pursuit of equality. As the United States moved deeper into the years following the Civil War, the initial clarity of Reconstruction began to soften. The shared sense of urgency that had accompanied the wars and gradually gave way to differing ideas about how the nation should move forward. While the goal of restoring stability was widely accepted, opinions varied sharply on what stability should look like and who should guide its return. For some Americans, unity meant reconciliation above all else. They believed the country could only heal by restoring familiar structures and minimizing prolonged federal involvement. In this view, rapid normalization promised economic recovery and social calm. The wounds of war, they felt, would best be addressed through patience and local decision-making, allowing communities to determine their own paths forward. Others held a different perspective. They argued that unity without protection risked repeating old patterns. Without oversight, the freedoms newly established in law might not be realized in daily life. These voices emphasized the importance of continued federal presence, not as control for its own sake, but as a safeguard during a fragile transition. To them, unity required not only reunion, but fairness. Between these positions lay a wide spectrum of opinion, shaped by geography, experience, and economic interest. In some regions, cooperation between local authorities and federal initiatives continued, fostering gradual progress. In others, resistance emerged quietly. It did not always take the form of open defiance. More often, it appeared as delayed compliance, limited enforcement, or subtle reinterpretation of new rules. Control over labor and land remained central to these competing paths. Employers sought predictability and productivity, while workers sought security and autonomy. Contracts, wages, and working conditions became points of negotiation and sometimes tension. These discussions were rarely dramatic. They unfolded in offices, fields, and meeting halls, shaping outcomes one agreement at a time. Local governance also reflected these divisions. Some communities embraced expanded participation, holding elections that included voices previously excluded. Others worked to preserve traditional power structures, favoring continuity over change. These choices influenced not only political representation, but access to education, credit, and public services. Resistance, when it appeared, was often framed as a desire for order. Many Americans were weary of conflict and uncertainty. The presence of federal agents, new laws, and unfamiliar institutions could feel intrusive, even when their purpose was protective. Calls for local control resonated with those who associated stability with autonomy and tradition at the same time. Those advocating continued reform recognized how easily gains could be reversed. They observed that laws without enforcement offered limited protection, and that economic inequality could undermine legal equality. Their arguments emphasized patience and persistence, urging the nation not to retreat too quickly from its commitments. These debates did not occur in isolation. Economic conditions influenced public sentiment. Financial downturns, competition for jobs, and shifting markets added pressure to already strained communities. When resources felt scarce, tolerance for prolonged reform diminished. Unity, for some, came to mean restoring efficiency rather than expanding opportunity. The federal government itself reflected these tensions. Policies evolved, funding priorities shifted, and enforcement varied by region. Reconstruction was no longer a single unified project, but a collection of efforts shaped by negotiation and compromise. The absence of a clear, long-term consensus made outcomes uneven. For individuals navigating daily life, these abstract debates translated into practical uncertainty. Families planning for the future found themselves adapting to changing expectations. Teachers wondered whether schools would remain funded. Workers questioned the reliability of contracts. Progress felt possible, yet never fully secure. Over time, the balance between unity and reform tilted. The language of reconciliation gained prominence, while the language of transformation grew quieter. The nation's attention turned toward growth, expansion, and modernization. Reconstruction, once central, became one concern among many. This shift did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, marked by incremental decisions rather than dramatic reversals. Each choice whether to renew a program, enforce a regulation, or intervene in a dispute contributed to the direction taken. Resistance did not always announce itself. Often, it simply waited as this chapter settles into evening. The image that emerges is one of crossroads rather than conclusions. The nation faced multiple paths forward, each shaped by values and priorities that were deeply felt, yet rarely unanimous. Unity, control, and resistance existed side by side, influencing outcomes in subtle ways. Understanding this moment helps explain why Reconstruction's early promise proved difficult to sustain. It was not undone by a single decision, but by the gradual preference for familiarity over change. The competing paths forward reflected a nation still learning how to balance peace with progress. In the quiet rhythm of these years, history advanced without urgency. The choices made often cautiously, sometimes reluctantly shaped the boundaries of opportunity that followed. And as the country continued its journey, the consequences of these competing visions would become clearer, settling gently but firmly into the long unfolding story of American economic and social life. As Reconstruction continued, the most significant challenges to progress did not always appear in open conflict or formal declarations. Instead, they emerged quietly, woven into daily life through uncertainty, intimidation, and disruption. Though the war had ended, its echoes lingered in subtler forms, shaping economic behavior and community stability without the presence of traditional battlefields. Violence during this period was often informal and localized, lacking the structure of armies or the visibility of military campaigns. It appeared in scattered incidents, rumors, and warnings enough to influence decisions without drawing sustained national attention. These actions were not always intended to seize territory or overthrow institutions. Rather, they aimed to create hesitation, discourage participation, and preserve existing power relationships. Economic life proved especially vulnerable to these conditions. Starting a business, purchasing land, or negotiating a contract required confidence in the future. When uncertainty prevailed, long-term planning became difficult. Families delayed investments, avoided risks, and focused on immediate survival. Fear did not need to be constant to be effective. Its presence in the background was often enough dot in rural areas, where agriculture formed the backbone of local economies. Stability depended on predictable seasons and secure labor arrangements. Disruptions, whether through threats, sabotage, or the sudden withdrawal of protection, undermined trust. Crops left unharvested, contracts left unfulfilled, and credit left unpaid all carried lasting consequences. Over time, these patterns limited growth and reinforced dependency. Urban communities experienced similar effects in different forms. Skilled laborers, small merchants, and service workers depended on steady demand and safe conditions. When unrest or intimidation affected neighborhoods, commerce slowed. Shops closed early, gatherings dispersed, and opportunities narrowed. Economic disruption often preceded visible decline, shaping outcomes before they were fully recognized. The absence of formal battlefields made these challenges harder to address. Without clear fronts or identifiable engagements, responsibility was diffuse. Local authorities varied in their willingness or ability to intervene. Federal resources were limited and inconsistently deployed. The result was an environment where disruptions could persist without sustained response. For individuals seeking to exercise new rights, such as voting, education, or independent labor, the atmosphere of uncertainty carried practical implications. Participation required visibility, and visibility sometimes brought risk. Many responded by choosing caution. This restraint was not a lack of ambition, but a strategy for navigating unstable conditions. Over time, these individual decisions accumulated into broader patterns. When fewer people pursued land ownership, fewer markets developed. When fewer children attended school consistently, educational gains slowed. Economic progress, which depended on collective momentum, weakened quietly. The effects were gradual, rarely traumatic, yet deeply influential. National attention, meanwhile, was often drawn elsewhere. Economic expansion in other regions, technological innovation, and political developments competed for focus. Without sustained awareness, localized disruptions remained fragmented stories rather than a unified concern. The absence of widespread coverage allowed conditions to persist largely unchecked. Importantly, the presence of fear did not eliminate resilience. Communities adapted in creative ways, relying on mutual support, shared knowledge, and informal networks. Churches, schools, and family connections provided stability where formal systems faltered. These efforts did not erase risk, but they offered continuity. Yet adaptation came at a cost. Energy devoted to self-protection could not be invested elsewhere. Time spent navigating uncertainty reduced capacity for growth. Economic inequality, once addressed openly in policy discussions, became reinforced through daily experience. The concept of violence during this era must be understood broadly, not only as physical harm, but as an environment that limited choice. When fear shapes behavior, it alters outcomes without leaving obvious marks. This form of disruption proved particularly enduring because it blended into routine life. As Reconstruction progressed, the persistence of these conditions contributed to shifting priorities. Policymakers measured success by surface calm rather than underlying security. The absence of open conflict was taken as a sign of resolution. Even when economic participation remained constrained. In the evening light of this chapter, the nation appears outwardly settled, yet inwardly unsettled. The war was over, laws had been passed, and institutions established. Still, the quiet influence of fear continued to shape economic paths. Understanding this period requires listening for what is not always spoken. The absence of battlefields did not mean the absence of struggle. Instead, it marked a transition to challenges that were less visible, but no less significant. As the story moves forward, these patterns help explain why early hopes proved difficult to sustain. Economic equality depends not only on policy, but on conditions that allow people to act without fear. When those conditions weaken, progress slows even in silence. And so, in the stillness of these years, history advanced quietly, shaped by decisions made under pressure that rarely announced itself. The legacy of this era would not be measured by what was destroyed in war, but by what was never fully allowed to grow, settling gently into the fabric of the nation's unfolding story. As the years passed after the Civil War, the urgency that once surrounded Reconstruction began to soften. What had initially felt like a defining national mission gradually became one concern among many. The country was no longer standing at the edge of immediate crisis. Trains ran again, markets reopened, and daily routines settled into familiar rhythms. In this return to normalcy, the intense focus on reform slowly faded. Reconstruction had required sustained attention, funding, and political will. In its early years, these elements were present, driven by the moral weight of emancipation and the visible devastation left by war. Over time, however, distance from the conflict altered perspective. For many Americans, especially those far from the former battlefields, the war began to feel like a closed chapter rather than an ongoing responsibility. Economic priorities shifted accordingly. Industrial growth accelerated in the North and West, drawing attention toward expansion, innovation, and profit. Railroads stretched across the continent. Factories increased production, and new markets emerged. These developments reshaped national conversation, emphasizing opportunity and progress in forward-looking terms rather than reflection on unfinished reforms. Political fatigue also played a role. Reconstruction had been complex, often contentious, and difficult to implement uniformly. Repeated debates over funding, enforcement, and authority tested patience. For lawmakers and voters alike, the process felt prolonged. Calls for resolution grew louder, not necessarily because goals had been achieved, but because many desired closure. In this environment, reform became increasingly framed as optional rather than essential. Programs initially designed as temporary measures were allowed to expire. Oversight was reduced, and enforcement became inconsistent. These changes rarely occurred through dramatic announcements. Instead, they unfolded through budget adjustments, administrative decisions, and shifting priorities that attracted little public attention. The language used to describe national goals evolved as well. Earlier discussions of equality and protection gave way to themes of reconciliation and efficiency. Stability was valued, and visible calm was often taken as evidence of success. The absence of widespread unrest became a benchmark. Even when deeper disparities remained, local governance filled the resulting gaps in uneven ways. Some communities continued to support education, fair labor practices, and civic participation. Others moved toward more restrictive interpretations of reform-era policies. Without strong national coordination, outcomes varied widely. Progress depended increasingly on local conditions rather than shared standards. For individuals affected by these changes, the retreat from reform introduced new uncertainty. Families who had relied on federal programs or protections found themselves navigating complex systems alone. Teachers questioned whether schools would remain funded. Workers faced evolving labor arrangements with fewer avenues for appeal. These shifts did not always bring immediate hardship, but they altered long-term prospects. Public attention followed visible narratives. Stories of economic growth, westward movement, and technological advancement dominated headlines. The quieter consequences of reduced reform efforts rarely captured sustained interest. As a result, disparities that developed did so without broad recognition, settling gradually into the background of national life. Importantly, the waning commitment to Reconstruction was not always rooted in hostility. Often, it reflected competing concerns and limited capacity. Policymakers balanced multiple pressures, responding to economic cycles, political alliances, and public sentiment. In choosing where to focus, some issues were inevitably left behind. This gradual retreat reshaped the meaning of reform itself. What had once been envisioned as a transformative project became redefined as a transitional phase. Equality, initially treated as a condition to be actively built, came to be viewed as something that would emerge naturally over time. This assumption reduced the perceived need for intervention. Yet history suggests that change without guidance rarely unfolds evenly. As support diminished, structural inequalities hardened. Opportunities became increasingly influenced by starting position rather than shared access. These patterns developed quietly, without the urgency that had once driven reform. As evening settles over this chapter, the nation appears settled on the surface, moving forward with confidence. Beneath that surface, however, the retreat from Reconstruction left unanswered questions. The ideals that had guided early efforts remained part of the national vocabulary, but their practical application grew limited. Understanding this period requires recognizing how reform can fade without being formally rejected. The absence of sustained commitment does not announce itself loudly. Instead, it manifests through omission, through what is no longer prioritized, funded, or enforced. In the calm that followed the war, the country chose continuity over confrontation, growth over reflection. These choices shaped the boundaries of opportunity that followed, influencing economic and social outcomes long after Reconstruction itself receded from view. As the story continues, the effects of this retreat become clearer. The promise of reform did not vanish entirely, but it was set aside, waiting quietly in the historical record. And in that quiet, the nation moved forward, carrying both the progress it had achieved and the possibilities it had left unfinished. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction had entered a quieter and more uncertain phase. The bold ambitions that once guided national policy had gradually softened, shaped by years of debate, fatigue, and shifting priorities. Into this atmosphere came a moment that would quietly redefine the nation's direction, not through sweeping legislation or public ceremony, but through negotiation behind closed doors. The presidential election of 1876 unfolded during this fragile period. The country, still healing from war and reform, found itself divided and uncertain. The results were contested, with no clear resolution immediately apparent. For months, the outcome remained unsettled, drawing attention away from broader questions of reform and toward the immediate need for Political clarity. As discussions continued, the overriding concern among many leaders was stability. The nation had endured years of upheaval, and the prospect of renewed conflict, political or otherwise, felt deeply unsettling. In this context, compromise emerged as a practical solution. Agreements were reached quietly, prioritizing a peaceful transition of power and the restoration of confidence in national governance. This moment became known as the Compromise of 1877, though its details were never formally recorded in a single document. Its effects, however, were far-reaching. Federal troops, who had played a role in maintaining order and enforcing certain Reconstruction-era policies, were withdrawn from southern states. In return, political resolution was achieved, and the immediate crisis was resolved. For many Americans, this outcome brought a sense of relief. The prolonged uncertainty surrounding the election had weighed heavily on public confidence. Markets stabilized, governance resumed, and daily life continued without disruption. On the surface, the compromise appeared to have achieved its goal: calm without confrontation. Yet beneath this calm lay significant consequences. The withdrawal of federal presence altered the balance of authority at the local level. Without consistent oversight, the enforcement of reform-era protections became uneven. Decisions about education, labor, and civic participation increasingly rested with local institutions, whose priorities varied widely. The shift was subtle rather than abrupt. There were no dramatic announcements signaling the end of Reconstruction. Instead, change occurred through absence. Programs were not renewed, enforcement waned, and the federal government stepped back from its earlier role as guarantor of certain standards. Over time, this retreat reshaped everyday realities. For individuals navigating this transition, the effects unfolded gradually. Some communities experienced little immediate change, while others saw opportunities narrow. Access to education, fair labor practices, and civic engagement became more dependent on local conditions. The sense of national commitment that had once supported reform grew distant. From a broader perspective, the Compromise of 1877 marked a turning point in how the nation balanced ideals with pragmatism. Stability was achieved, but at the cost of momentum. The vision of Reconstruction as a sustained effort to reshape opportunity gave way to a focus on reconciliation and economic growth. Importantly, this choice was not framed publicly as abandonment. Rather, it was presented as resolution. The language of compromise emphasized unity, healing, and forward movement. These themes resonated with a population eager to move beyond years of tension. However, the long-term implications became clearer with time. Without federal support, disparities that Reconstruction had sought to address became more entrenched. Economic inequality widened quietly, shaped by access to land, credit, and education. These outcomes were not immediate, but cumulative. The Compromise of 1877 illustrates how pivotal decisions can occur without broad public debate. In prioritizing short-term calm, the nation accepted a narrower role for federal involvement in ensuring equality. This recalibration influenced policy for decades, shaping how responsibility for social and economic conditions was understood. As evening settles over this chapter of history, the scene appears peaceful. Power was transferred, institutions functioned, and the country moved forward. Yet the quiet nature of this moment belied its significance. Transformation was paused in favor of stability, and the consequences of that choice unfolded slowly. Understanding this period requires recognizing how compromise can resolve immediate crises while leaving deeper questions unanswered. The Compromise of 1877 did not end Reconstruction with a declaration. It allowed it to fade through consensus and convenience. In the gentle rhythm of these years, the nation chose certainty over experimentation, calm over continued reform. This decision did not erase the ideals that had guided earlier efforts, but it set them aside, leaving their fulfillment to an uncertain future as the story continues. The legacy of this compromise becomes increasingly evident. The structures that remained, and those that were no longer supported, shaped the economic and social landscape that followed. And so, in quiet agreement, rather than open conflict, a transformative chapter of American history drew toward its close, leaving behind questions that would echo far beyond the moment itself. As the 19th century drew toward its close, the United States appeared outwardly settled. The war was decades past, elections proceeded on schedule, and institutions functioned with familiar rhythm. Yet beneath this surface calm, the nation's legal framework was slowly reshaping everyday opportunity. These changes did not arrive with fanfare. They emerged through court opinions, administrative practices, and the steady accumulation of precedent-altering lives quietly. One ruling at a time, law has a unique way of shaping society without raising its voice. A decision rendered in a distant chamber can influence where people live, how they travel, where they work, and what education they receive. During this period, the legal system increasingly defined separation as compatible with equality, establishing standards that would guide public life for generations. Courts were asked to interpret new constitutional amendments alongside older assumptions about governance and social order. The resulting decisions reflected both progress and restraint. While citizenship and equal protection were recognized in principle, their application was often narrowed. Equality came to be measured not by outcomes, but by formal access by, whether rules appeared neutral on their face. One of the most influential moments in this process arrived with the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. The decision affirmed that separation in public facilities could be lawful if accommodations were deemed equivalent. This reasoning rested on a distinction between legal equality and social practice, suggesting that the law could permit separation without endorsing inequality. The ruling did not mandate separation everywhere, but it provided a legal framework that allowed it to expand. States and local governments gained clarity on how to structure public spaces, transportation, and institutions. Over time, these choices shaped daily routines where people sat, studied, waited, and worked. Importantly, the effects of such decisions extended beyond physical separation. Access to resources followed institutional lines. Schools, transportation systems, and public services differed in quality, funding, and reach. These differences were not always immediately visible, but they influenced opportunity in lasting ways. Economic life responded accordingly. Businesses adapted to local regulations, labor markets adjusted, and patterns of investment followed perceived stability. Where services were limited or infrastructure underdeveloped, growth slowed. The law, by setting boundaries, indirectly guided where capital flowed and where it hesitated. For individuals navigating these systems, the changes felt incremental. A route taken, a school assigned, a job opportunity declined. Each decision shaped experience without dramatic announcement. Over time, these small moments accumulated, forming pathways that were easier for some to follow than others. Legal separation also influenced expectations. When institutions normalized division, it shaped how communities understood belonging and access. Opportunity became associated with certain spaces and networks, reinforcing patterns that were difficult to disrupt. The law did not need to compel inequality actively. It allowed it to persist through structure. National attention to these developments was uneven. Court decisions were reported, but their implications unfolded slowly. Without immediate crisis, public concern remained limited. The focus of national conversation often rested elsewhere on economic expansion, innovation, and international affairs. Meanwhile, the legal system continued to refine its interpretations. Lower courts applied precedents. Administrators developed procedures, and local governments crafted policies within the boundaries set by higher rulings. Each layer added specificity, further embedding separation into daily life. But it is important to recognize that these changes were not experienced uniformly. Some communities sought to mitigate disparities, investing in education and services despite constraints. Others embraced the clarity provided by legal precedent, organizing institutions accordingly. The result was a patchwork of conditions, shaped by local choice within national boundaries. From a historical perspective, this era illustrates how law can influence economic and social outcomes indirectly. By defining what is permissible, it shapes what becomes common. Over time, common practice gains the appearance of inevitability, even when it originates in specific decisions. As evening settles over this chapter, the nation appears orderly, governed by rules that promise fairness while allowing separation. The transformation is subtle, woven into routine rather than imposed through force. Opportunity is restructured quietly, guided by legal reasoning that prioritizes form over effect. Understanding this moment helps explain how economic inequality can deepen without overt conflict. When access diverges gradually, disparities expand without triggering immediate alarm. The law's calm authority lends legitimacy to arrangements that feel stable, even as they limit mobility. In the long arc of American history, these decisions marked a shift from Reconstruction's expansive vision to a narrower interpretation of equality. Rights remained in language, but their reach was constrained by structure. The result was not a sudden reversal, but a measured redirection. As the story continues, the consequences of this quiet restructuring become more visible. The boundaries set during this period influenced education, employment, and wealth for decades. And in the stillness of legal chambers and everyday routines, opportunity took on a new shape, one defined less by promise and more by precedent, settling gently yet firmly into the nation's unfolding story. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the most powerful forces shaping American life were no longer always visible in laws or headlines. Instead, they appeared quietly in patterns where families lived, how they worked, and what opportunities felt within reach. These patterns, once set in motion, tended to persist, casting long shadows across generations. Economic disadvantage rarely announces itself dramatically. More often, it unfolds through accumulation. A missed opportunity leads to limited savings. Limited savings restrict education or mobility. Restricted choices, in turn, shape the prospects of the next generation. Over time, these effects compound, creating differences that feel natural or inevitable, even when they originated in specific historical moments. For families who had gained early access to land, education, or stable employment, the post-Reconstruction era offered pathways to gradual growth. Small advantages, owning property, accessing credit, or inheriting skills, made it easier to weather economic downturns and invest in the future. These families built modest security that strengthened over time. For others, the absence of such foundations made progress more difficult. Without land to borrow against, education to open doors, or savings to absorb risk, each setback carried greater weight. Economic life became more reactive than planned. Stability depended heavily on external conditions rather than long-term strategy. This divergence did not occur overnight. In many cases, families began the 20th century with similar hopes and aspirations. What differed were their starting positions. Access to quality schools, reliable transportation, and growing job markets varied widely by region and community. These differences influenced not only income, but confidence, the belief that effort would lead to reward. The concept of inheritance extended beyond material wealth. Knowledge, networks, and expectations were passed down alongside property. Children learned what paths were available by observing the adults around them. Where opportunity was visible, ambition felt practical. Where it was limited, caution became a form of wisdom. Public narratives often emphasized individual effort, celebrating stories of self-made success. These stories inspired many, yet they did not fully account for uneven starting points. Hard work remained essential, but its outcomes varied depending on circumstances shaped long before any individual choice was made. Over time, these disparities influenced broader economic patterns. Communities with concentrated opportunity attracted investment, reinforcing growth. Those without struggled to retain resources, leading to cycles of stagnation. These trends were not always dramatic. They unfolded gradually, reflected in school funding, housing quality, and employment options. The long shadow of disadvantage also shaped responses to change. When new industries emerged or economic shifts occurred, those with flexibility adapted more easily. Education and mobility enabled transition. Others faced disruption without alternatives, deepening existing gaps. Importantly, disadvantage was not solely economic. It affected health, longevity, and participation in civic life. Stress associated with instability influenced well-being. Limited access to healthcare and safe environments shaped outcomes in ways that extended beyond income. Yet within these constraints, resilience persisted. Families and communities developed strategies to support one another, sharing resources and knowledge. Informal networks provided stability where formal systems fell short. These efforts sustained hope, even when progress was slow. Nationally, the accumulation of disadvantage contributed to widening inequality. Differences that began as modest variations grew more pronounced over decades. By the mid-20th century, these patterns were deeply embedded, often perceived as natural features of the social landscape, rather than results of historical processes. Understanding this long shadow requires patience. It is tempting to search for single causes or moments of change, but the reality is quieter. Disadvantage settles in through repetition, through the consistent absence of opportunity, rather than dramatic loss. As this chapter draws toward evening, the focus shifts from individual moments to continuity. The past does not disappear when laws change or eras end. It carries forward through structures, habits, and expectations. The choices made during Reconstruction and its aftermath continued to influence lives long after the period itself faded from memory. Recognizing this continuity does not diminish individual effort or achievement. Instead, it adds context, revealing how deeply history shapes the present. Opportunity is never distributed in a vacuum. It is guided by pathways laid down over time. In the stillness of this reflection, the nation's story appears less like a series of turning points and more like a long road. Some traveled it with steady footing, others with obstacles that slowed their pace. The distance between them widened quietly, shaped by forces that were rarely announced. As the story moves forward, this long shadow remains present, not as a fixed destiny, but as a reminder that equality, once delayed, becomes harder to restore. And in that quiet understanding, the past continues to speak softly, influencing the present and the future alike, as America carries forward the consequences of choices made long ago. History is not remembered only through documents and dates. It lives quietly in stories told at kitchen tables, in lessons emphasized or omitted in classrooms, and in assumptions carried from one generation to the next. As Reconstruction faded into the distance, the way Americans remembered that era became as influential as what had actually occurred. Memory, silence, and myth slowly shaped the nation's understanding of its own past. In the years following Reconstruction, public storytelling began to simplify complex events. The Civil War was remembered as a clash resolved, the nation reunited, the future secured. The long and uncertain work of rebuilding, especially its economic dimensions, received far less attention. What was remembered tended to emphasize closure rather than continuation. Silence played an important role in this process. Certain experiences were discussed less frequently, not always because they were forgotten, but because they were difficult to explain or uncomfortable to revisit. When stories are not shared, they do not disappear. Instead, they fade into the background, shaping perception indirectly. Within families, memories were often selective. Some elders spoke of hardship, perseverance, and resilience. Others focused on progress and opportunity, emphasizing how far the nation had come. Rarely were these narratives comprehensive. Each reflected lived experience, shaped by place, circumstance, and outcome. Over time, these partial stories merged into broader cultural myths. The idea that equality naturally followed emancipation became common, even when reality had been uneven. Reconstruction was sometimes portrayed as a brief and resolved episode rather than a sustained and contested effort. These simplified narratives made the past easier to digest, but they obscured important lessons. Education systems reinforced these patterns. Textbooks summarized complex periods into manageable chapters, emphasizing major events while minimizing gradual change. Economic struggles, policy retreats, and long-term consequences were often condensed or omitted. Students learned that Reconstruction ended, but not always why its goals remained unfinished. Popular culture further shaped memory. Novels, films, and public commemorations highlighted certain themes while overlooking others. Stories of reconciliation and national unity resonated widely, offering comfort and coherence. Stories of lost opportunity and structural inequality were less frequently centered. As they complicated familiar narratives, myth does not require falsehood to be powerful. It thrives on emphasis. By highlighting some elements and downplaying others, collective memory can shift perception without altering facts outright. Over time, these shifts influence how society understands responsibility, progress, and possibility. The economic dimensions of Reconstruction were particularly vulnerable to this process. Land policy, labor systems, and access to education lacked dramatic moments that easily translated into popular storytelling. Their impact unfolded slowly, making them harder to capture in a single image or event. As a result, they were often sidelined. Silence also emerged from fatigue. Revisiting Reconstruction meant confronting unresolved questions about fairness and opportunity. As the nation focused on growth and modernization, there was little appetite for reflection that might challenge optimism. Forgetting, or at least not emphasizing, became a way to move forward. Yet memory persisted in quieter forms. In communities where opportunity remained limited, stories were passed down that hinted at earlier possibilities. These narratives were not always formal or complete, but they conveyed a sense that the past held unanswered questions. Even without detailed explanation, they shaped identity. At the national level, the accumulation of simplified memory influenced policy discussions. When history is remembered as settled, present disparities appear detached from past decisions. Inequality can be framed as individual circumstance rather than historical outcome. Myth smooths continuity, making long-term patterns seem coincidental. Recognizing this process does not require assigning blame. Memory is shaped by human need for coherence and meaning. Nations, like individuals, construct stories that help them understand themselves. The challenge lies in acknowledging what those stories leave out. As this chapter settles into quiet reflection, it becomes clear that history's influence depends not only on what happened, but on how it is remembered. Silence can be as powerful as speech. Myth can guide perception as effectively as fact. Revisiting Reconstruction through a fuller lens allows for a more nuanced understanding of the present. It does not diminish progress achieved since that era, but it clarifies why certain aspirations proved difficult to realize fully. Memory, when expanded, offers context rather than comfort alone. In the gentle rhythm of passing generations, stories continue to evolve. What is remembered today shapes what will be questioned tomorrow. By listening carefully, To both what is said and what is missing, the nation gains a deeper awareness of its own journey. As the story moves forward, the task becomes one of quiet attention. History speaks softly through memory and silence alike. And in that soft voice lies an invitation not to reopen old conflicts, but to understand how the past continues to inform the present, shaping expectations, assumptions, and possibilities long after the original events have faded from view. As time created distance from the Reconstruction era, its original ambitions became easier to overlook. What remained most visible were the outcomes: some progress, some stability, and many unresolved disparities. Yet beneath these results lay an earlier ideal that once guided national conversation: the belief that shared prosperity was not only desirable, but achievable through collective effort. In the years immediately following the Civil War, shared prosperity was understood as a practical necessity. The nation had emerged from conflict deeply divided, economically disrupted, and socially fragmented. Rebuilding required more than restoring order. It required creating conditions in which participation was possible across communities. Economic inclusion was seen as a stabilizing force, reducing dependence and encouraging long-term growth. This ideal did not suggest uniform outcomes, but fair opportunity. It recognized that individuals would follow different paths, yet believed that access to land, education, and work should not be predetermined by circumstance. Prosperity, in this view, was something that expanded when barriers were lowered and participation widened. Over time, as Reconstruction receded, this framing softened. Prosperity came to be associated more closely with individual initiative, detached from structural conditions. The earlier emphasis on shared foundations, schools, infrastructure, legal protections gave way to a focus on personal advancement. While effort remained important, the role of collective investment faded from view. Revisiting the original ideal requires returning to its context. Post-war leaders understood that economic imbalance threatened national cohesion. Regions left behind would struggle to contribute fully, and disparities could undermine trust in institutions. Shared prosperity was not framed as charity, but as a strategy for stability. Education, in particular, was seen as central. Schools were investments in future productivity, civic participation, and adaptability. When education was expanded, it strengthened communities beyond immediate returns. This long-term perspective was a defining feature of Reconstruction's vision. Similarly, access to land and fair labor practices were viewed as means of anchoring families economically. Ownership and stable income allowed for planning, saving, and intergenerational continuity. These elements reduced vulnerability to economic shocks, benefiting not only individuals, but local economies. As these ideas lost prominence, their absence became noticeable only gradually. Without shared foundations, prosperity concentrated where resources already existed. Growth continued, but unevenly. Regions and communities diverged, not necessarily because of effort, but because of access. Revisiting the ideal does not require idealizing the past. Reconstruction's vision was imperfect and constrained by its era. Not all voices were included, and not all proposals were feasible. Yet the willingness to articulate shared prosperity as a goal marked a significant moment in national thought. This willingness reflected an understanding that markets alone could not resolve deep structural disruption. Policy, education, and institutional support were necessary complements. When these elements aligned, progress accelerated. When they receded, advancement slowed. In the modern lens, the idea of shared prosperity can feel abstract, even aspirational. Yet historically, it was grounded in concrete measures: schools built, contracts regulated, land distributed, and rights protected. Its strength lay in its practicality rather than its rhetoric. Memory plays a role here as well. When the past is remembered primarily through outcomes rather than intentions, ideals can seem unrealistic. Revisiting them restores perspective, showing that alternative paths were once considered viable. As this chapter unfolds quietly, it invites reflection rather than judgment. What does it mean for prosperity to be shared? How do foundations influence outcomes? These questions are not bound to a single era. They recur whenever societies confront inequality. The value of revisiting Reconstruction's ideal lies in understanding that progress is not automatic. It requires alignment between values and action. Shared prosperity was not meant to eliminate difference, but to reduce unnecessary limitation. In the stillness of this reflection, the nation's story appears layered. Beneath familiar narratives of growth and success lies an earlier conversation about inclusion and stability. That conversation did not disappear. It was simply paused. As the story continues. Revisiting this ideal offers a lens through which to interpret both past and present. It highlights the role of collective choice in shaping opportunity and reminds use that prosperity, when broadly accessible, strengthens the whole. In the quiet passage of time, ideals may fade, but they do not vanish entirely. They remain available for reconsideration, waiting patiently in the historical record. And in returning to them thoughtfully, the nation gains not only insight into what was lost, but clarity about what was once imagined and why it mattered. History often teaches its most enduring lessons, not through moments of triumph, but through efforts that fell short of their original aims. The Reconstruction era, with its ambitious vision and incomplete outcomes, offers such lessons. To understand why true economic equality remained elusive, it is necessary to look not for singular mistakes, but for recurring patterns, roadblocks that quietly limited progress over time. One of the most persistent challenges was the absence of sustained commitment. Reconstruction began with urgency, driven by moral clarity and immediate necessity. Yet long-term change required patience measured in decades, not years. As national attention shifted, the intensity that once fueled reform diminished. Without continued focus, early gains struggled to hold. Economic equality depends heavily on continuity. Schools must remain funded, labor protections enforced, and access to opportunity preserved across generations. When support is temporary, progress becomes fragile. The Reconstruction experience demonstrated how easily advances can erode when institutions are not reinforced. Another significant roadblock lay in the tension between national goals and local control. While federal authority enabled reform, its reach was uneven. Local implementation varied widely, influenced by regional priorities and economic interests. In the absence of consistent standards, outcomes diverged. Equality, meant to be national in scope, became fragmented. This fragmentation affected economic systems deeply. Labor arrangements, credit access, and education funding differed by location, creating uneven starting points. Where resources aligned with reform, opportunity expanded. Where they did not, disparities widened. The lack of coordination allowed inequality to settle quietly into place. Legal frameworks also contributed to limitation. Laws defined rights, but their interpretation shaped reality. When enforcement narrowed, protections weakened. Legal clarity sometimes prioritized order over equity, allowing separation and imbalance to persist under the appearance of fairness. Importantly, these outcomes were often the result of incremental decisions rather than deliberate reversals. Budgets were adjusted, programs allowed to expire, and oversight reduced. Each choice seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they redirected the course of reform. Economic systems reinforced these patterns. Without access to land or capital, many families remained dependent on arrangements that limited mobility. Debt accumulated, savings remained scarce, and investment in future generations became difficult. These constraints compounded, turning short-term limitation into long-term disadvantage. Cultural narratives further shaped outcomes. As stories emphasized individual success, structural barriers received less attention. Hard work was celebrated, while unequal access was rarely examined. This framing made disparities easier to overlook, attributing outcomes to effort rather than circumstance. Education, too, reflected these roadblocks. While early Reconstruction invested heavily in learning, uneven support later constrained its reach. Schools differed in quality and availability, influencing opportunity in subtle but lasting ways. Education's role as an equalizer weakened when access was inconsistent. Another lesson lies in the balance between speed and depth. Reconstruction attempted rapid transformation in a nation still healing from war. While necessary, speed came at the cost of durability. Institutions need time to mature, trust to build, and systems to stabilize. When reform moves faster than consensus, it risks reversal, yet consensus itself can be shaped. Reconstruction revealed that public understanding matters. When goals are not clearly communicated or broadly supported, momentum fades. Reform requires not only policy, but shared belief in its necessity. Looking back, it becomes clear that equality cannot be achieved through isolated measures. It requires alignment across law, economy, education, and culture. When one element advances while others lag, progress remains incomplete. The value of learning from these failures lies not in assigning fault, but in recognizing complexity. The challenges faced were real, shaped by fatigue, fear, and competing priorities. Understanding them offers insight into how future efforts might avoid similar limitations. As this chapter settles into reflection, the past appears neither distant nor resolved. The roadblocks identified during Reconstruction echo across time, reminding us that equality is not a destination reached once, but a condition maintained through care. In the quiet of historical study, patterns emerge gently. They show how good intentions can falter without structure, and how progress requires patience as well as resolve. These lessons are not bound to a single era. They remain relevant whenever societies attempt meaningful change. As the story continues, the focus shifts from what went wrong to what can be understood. The failures of the past, when examined calmly, offer guidance rather than regret. They illuminate the pathways that were blocked and suggest how future paths might remain open. In this still moment, history offers its quiet counsel that equality, once postponed, grows harder to achieve, but once understood, it becomes clearer how it might be pursued with greater care, consistency, and wisdom. As the long arc of this story draws gently toward its close, what remains is not a conclusion, but an opening. The history of Reconstruction and its aftermath does not settle neatly into the past. Instead, it lingers quietly, shaping the present, influencing patterns of opportunity, and informing how the nation understands itself. It is, in many ways, an unfinished chapter. The end of Reconstruction did not mark the end of the questions it raised. How should freedom be supported in daily life? What responsibilities accompany citizenship? How does a nation ensure that opportunity is not limited by circumstance? These questions did not disappear when policies changed or attention shifted. They remained embedded in the fabric of American life, resurfacing in new forms across generations. Unfinished chapters are often the most instructive. They remind us that history is not only a record of what happened, but a collection of paths taken and paths left unexplored. Reconstruction offered a glimpse of what deliberate effort toward economic equality might look like. Its partial realization does not negate its significance. Instead, it highlights the difficulty of sustaining transformation over time. For many Americans, the effects of this unfinished work became part of everyday experience rather than public debate. Neighborhoods developed unevenly. Schools differed in quality and resources. Employment opportunities clustered in certain places while remaining scarce in others. These outcomes did not announce their origins, yet they carried forward decisions made long before. At the same time, progress continued in meaningful ways. The nation expanded access to education, modernized its economy, and broadened participation in civic life. These advances deserve recognition, yet acknowledging progress does not require overlooking what remained unresolved. Both truths can coexist. The idea of an unfinished chapter invites reflection rather than judgment. It suggests that history is ongoing, shaped by cumulative choices rather than single events. What was left incomplete in one era becomes context for the next. Each generation inherits not only achievements, but unanswered questions. In this sense, Reconstruction's legacy is not confined to textbooks. It lives in conversations about fairness, opportunity, and responsibility. It informs how Americans think about the relationship between effort and access, individual ambition and shared foundations. The quiet nature of this influence is important. History does not always move through dramatic turning points. Often, it advances through continuity, through systems that persist because they are familiar. Unfinished chapters endure because they blend into routine, becoming part of the landscape rather than subjects of scrutiny. Yet awareness changes perspective. When the past is understood as unfinished, the present appears more flexible. Patterns once assumed inevitable reveal their origins. Opportunity, once seen as fixed, appears shaped by choice. This understanding does not demand urgency or alarm. It invites patience. Change that endures often moves slowly, guided by reflection rather than reaction. The lessons of Reconstruction suggest that lasting progress depends on alignment between values and institutions. Intention and commitment. As this story settles into its final moments, it offers no directive, only context. The aspiration for economic equality was not abandoned because it lacked merit, but because sustaining it proved difficult. Recognizing that difficulty allows for a more generous understanding of the past and a more thoughtful approach to the future. In the quiet hours when this story is heard, perhaps as sleep approaches, it serves as a gentle reminder. Nations, like individuals, carry unfinished work. The presence of such work does not diminish what has been accomplished. Instead, it adds depth, revealing the layers of effort that shape progress. The unfinished chapter of Reconstruction remains open not as a burden, but as a reference point. It reminds us that ideals need time, care, and continuity to take root. When they falter, they leave traces, lessons written not in headlines, but in lived experience. As night deepens and this history recedes into stillness, the chapter closes without finality. The story continues beyond the page, carried forward by memory, understanding, and choice. And in that continuation lies the quiet truth of history, that what remains unfinished is not lost, but waiting patiently within the long, unfolding story of America.